Some called him a moderate conservative intellectual, others a revisionist Marxist. To some he was the master tactician of the general strike, to others a novel sociologist. Some hailed him as France's greatest socialist theoretician, others rightly dubbed him the intellectual forefather of fascism. His name was Georges Sorel, but who was he really? Sorel's legacy is messy and entirely contradictory. Throughout the course of his long life, he drifted between liberalism and orthodox Marxism, between revisionism and syndicalism, at times slipping towards reactionary monarchism, then back again. He greeted the Bolshevik Revolution with support, and greeted Italy's emerging fascism with comments that were alternately scathing, yet at times oddly hopeful. In the end, the messy collage of ideas he left behind yielded many readings by many intellectuals, be them communists, anarchists, or liberals. Yet, as this video will uncover, only one historical movement could plausibly have grown from the intellectual legacy he left behind: that of fascism. Some viewers will inevitably ask the important question, what is fascism? For those viewers, I would refer them to these videos, which are on screen right now, and answer all of the most important questions regarding fascist principles which they would likely have to ask. Now, back to the focus of the video. Georges Sorel did indeed inspire fascism, and this is a statement easy enough to make on its own, but how can one demonstrate this? Where did Sorel's ideological roots come from? This is the question that needs to be asked before anything can be suggested of where Sorel's tendencies went and what they inspired. In 1893, Georges Sorel abandoned his conservative ideals and became a Marxist intellectual when he began contributing to an orthodox Marxist paper known as the New Era. Even during this early period, Sorel was preoccupied with the idea of some sort of cultural decadence that he believed was thoroughly eroding European civilization. A decadence he blamed, above all else, not on Jews or on sexual degeneracy, but actually, strangely enough, on Christianity. According to Georges Sorel, the Christian ideology severed the links that existed between the spirit and social life. Everywhere it sowed seeds of quietism, despair, and death. This outlook is what, from the start, attracted Georges Sorel to Marxism. For Sorel, Marxism could be seen as nothing other than, quote, a doctrine of life that is good for strong peoples. It reduces ideology to the role of an artifice for the summary exposition of reality. It holds that economic development is the necessary condition for the creation of a new society. It teaches men to want to acquire the rights that they are able to bear responsibility for. Right off of the bat, Sorel's attraction to Marxism immediately seems very unorthodox. Georges Sorel wasn't attracted to Marxism for its scientific approach to history, or its attempt to rationalize all of the material world's development through some dialectical outlook. Sorel was interested in Marxism because he believed that it invoked the virtues of strength, duty, and responsibility. Georges Sorel believed that in requiring the believer to turn inwards for their personal spiritual interests, Christian faith had destroyed the ancient world and catapulted man into a society of hyper-individualists who cared not for country nor for kin. Christian egoism, says Sorel, was what gave rise to the bourgeoisie spirit itself. This moral decay caused by Christianity and the bourgeoisie spirit could only be halted, in Sorel's view, by a proletarian revolution. This moralistic character of Georges Sorel's literature would become fundamental in his intellectual development for the next few years to come. As we approach the mid-1890s, we encounter figures such as Jean Jaurès, who, influencing Sorel, believed that a conciliation between economic materialism and historical and moral idealism was necessary for Marxist thought. This belief was a staunch break from Marxist orthodoxy, and by 1897 it had become clear for Georges Sorel that Marxist thought had some serious shortcomings. From then on, he decidedly worked from outside of the Marxist orthodoxy and decided to chart a new course for the renewal of Marxism, as he called it, by Marxist methods. In the quest to map out his own worldview, Georges Sorel would dive deep into the writings of Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, the father of anarchism, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and the infamous idealist Henry Bergson. Sorel's goal was not to return to the ancient world in his quest to heal the modern world's decay, but instead, according to his disciple Edward Berth, to discover if any force existed that could save the modern world from a ruination similar to that which overtook the ancient world. The search for this hypothetical force preoccupied Georges Sorel for the entirety of his intellectual career from then onwards. As recalled by the historian Yves Sternhell in his book Fascist Ideology in France, to stop the decline of the modern world, Sorel believed that the individual needed to preserve and develop a sense of duty and honor. The individual needed to find something outside of himself that escapes the corrupting influences of modern life. As Sternhell goes on, it was to the search for this all-important element that Sorel devoted his entire existence. That is why his ideas changed so much, a fact that Sorel never attempted to conceal. Following the Dreyfus Affair, a very complicated historical event in and of itself, which I'm not going to get into in this video, Georges Sorel became convinced that French socialism had simply become a pacified liberal labor movement disguised with a mask of worker solidarity. In 1908, Sorel wrote his book Reflections on Violence. The socialism of Reflections on Violence was already quite far from Marxist thought in most ways. Reflections declared a socialism of myth, of action, of proletarian violence, a socialism of irrefutable conviction. But when the socialist revolution did not materialize as Sorel had conceived of it, when the glorious proletariat for which he had so many hopes made it clear that there would be no socialist revolution, once it was clear that the French working class was to do nothing to establish a socialist society, Sorel too changed his tune. Once it was clear that the proletariat would not be at the helm of leading some sort of civilizational regeneration, Georges Sorel founded the failed nationalist paper, The Independents, in 1911, before distancing himself from the journalist Nationalists and officially leaving it in 1913. Though he despised it, Sorel did give inspiration to the Cercle Proudhon, or Proudhon Cercle, founded in 1911 by his pupil Georges Valois. At a moment when Sorel had lost his illusions about the possibility of revolutionary syndicalism in France, and when Charles Maurras began to fear the alienation of his most conservative supporters, Cercle Proudhon became a place where both sides, the revolutionaries and the conservatives, could collaborate without too much compromise. The Cercle's very name itself recalled Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a thinker who was incredibly libertarian and socialist in spirit, while staunchly conservative at the same time. Since its foundations, Charles Maurras's ultra-conservative movement known as French Action regarded Proudhon as one of its ideological masters, and Edward Berth, at the same time, in 1908 attributed the spirit of revolutionary syndicalism to both Karl Marx as well as Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. The Proudhon Circle was the first genuine synthesis of nationalism and syndicalism in history, and is considered by various historians such as Zeev Sternhell and A. James Gregor as the birthplace of fascist ideology. In 1919, Georges Sorel would write the foreword to his final book, Materials for a Theory of the Proletariat, in which the nation and tradition were treated as the only morally creative forces, the only forces capable of bringing civilizational decline to its halt. Within his final foreword, Sorel states, "Democracy seeks, in all countries, the ruin of the forces that still keep national traditions somewhat alive," later stating that Charles Maurras, of course an infamous French conservative, if he succeeded in his anti-liberal endeavor, would take his place among those who deserve to be called masters of the moment. In attempting to revive the Marxism of Karl Marx, Sorel had given birth to something entirely new. Even within Reflections on Violence, the idea of a class struggle didn't mean the same thing to Sorel that it had to Marx. The idea of a class struggle simply represented, to him, an ideology in which the values of vitalism, intuition, pessimism, the cult of action, heroism, and proletarian violence could replace, and in fact discard with, the rationalist analyses of Karl Marx. Sorel had replaced the contents of Marxism with Gustave Le Bon's anti-rationalistic view of human nature, with the anti-Cartesian philosophy of Henry Bergson, with the cult of revolt inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche, and with various other contemporary developments in sociology brought on by figures such as Wilfred Pareto and Robert Michels. From this development, Sorel would eventually indeed abandon the Marxist framework entirely and turn his gaze towards nationalism. Georges Sorel, like his syndicalist compatriots Hubert Lagardelle and Robert Michels, had by the 1910s come to realize that the proletariat was incapable of sparking a revolution solely on its own accord. For these figures, the new revolutionary subject could no longer be a class group, it needed to be the nation. Like the revolutionary syndicalists who came before him, Georges Sorel finally conceded, quote, "It is not true that the capitalist system, in giving birth to a new form of proletariat, brought socialism into being. Socialism as an ideology existed before it." Unquote. If socialism could exist without being tied to any system of production, if socialism was some timeless concept as Sorel declares it to be, then the proletariat is only a necessary component of socialism insofar as it can act as a progressive agent of historical change. Around the start of the First World War, Georges Sorel lost his political relevance and lapsed mostly into silence. He would pass away in 1922, but his legacy would be felt in every crevice of Europe for the next 3 decades to come. Fast forward 10 years to 1932. This year, Prime Minister Benito Mussolini and Senator Giovanni Gentile would publish The Doctrine of Fascism. Within the Doctrine of Fascism, violence was conceived of as the primary mover of history. But from where did these towering giants of Italian history borrow such ideas? The concept can of course be traced directly back to the theoretical literature of Georges Sorel, particularly in Reflections on Violence. To Georges Sorel, violent struggle was the primary concern of the socialist movement, and was in fact far more important than the content of socialism itself. Socialism as an idea was most important to Georges Sorel only due to the nature of violence and struggle which it exposed the proletariat to. In Sorel's own words, we have tried to show that a new culture could arise from the struggles waged by the revolutionary syndicates against the bosses and against the state. Our greatest originality consists in having argued that the proletariat can emancipate itself without having to resort to the teachings of the bourgeoisie professionals of the intelligentsia, and we are thus led to consider as essential in contemporary phenomena what was once considered accessory, what is truly educational for a revolutionary proletariat, learning through struggle. Sorel's central political vision across all of his literature was, in short, the development of a culture of struggle. The sole function of socialism, in his own words, quote, consists in taking care of the proletariat, to explain to it the greatness of the revolutionary role it must play. By incessant critique, we must lead it to perfect its organizations. We must show it how it can develop embryonic formations that appear in its societies of resistance in order to arrive at constructing institutions that have no model in bourgeoisie history in order to form ideas that depend solely on its situation as a producer in large industry and that borrow nothing from bourgeoisie thought in order to acquire manners of freedom which the bourgeoisie no longer knows today. Sorel didn't ignore the fact that new kinds of institutions and social relations would form during this revolutionary struggle which he conceived of. Sorel never once ignored the fact that from this revolutionary spirit for which he advocated would develop new ideology and new behaviors. Sorel would go on stating, quote, "The revolution will be absolute and irreformable, because it will have the effect of returning the productive forces to the hands of the free man, that is to say, men capable of conducting themselves in the workshop created by capitalism without needing masters." Later on, these notions would again be taken up with the same vigor in Sorel's book The Illusions of Progress. Two notable Sorelian syndicalists, both of whom I have already mentioned in passing during this video, Hubert Lagardelle and Edward Berth, came into contact with Georges Sorel during the early 1900s. Sorel would come to consider both of those figures the most authoritative representatives of revolutionary syndicalism, period. Hubert Lagardelle, like Georges Sorel, believed that the syndicalists of France ought to convert their revolutionary struggle into a pedagogy of its own. According to Zeev Sternhell, this is why revolutionary syndicalism sought to develop the instincts of revolt of proletarians. All the originality of this syndicalism resided, for its ideologues, in this creation of proletarian institutions, generators of a new world, a new human reality. Lagardelle rages against schooling as a means of social ascent and intellectual integration of the proletariat, and ridicules the egalitarian spirit of the advanced democracy, whose aim is to transform workers educated in bourgeoisie schools into allies of the enemy class and stuffed with indigestible science. Only by separating completely from the bourgeoisie world can the working world discover its new conceptions of morality and law. According to Hubert Lagardelle, syndicates by professional category, through daily struggles against bosses waged in the very field of production, constitute a powerful factor of education, just as cooperatives do in the sphere of consumption. The working class grows by itself thanks to its persistent effort and its personal will, its technical capacity. It naturally prepares itself for the function that awaits it. It does not need to install itself at the heart of the capitalist regime. Outside that regime, and opposed to it, it is fully capable of completing its formation. Lagardelle continues, syndicalism starts from this postulate, repeated by us without cease, that what differentiates social classes are their institutions and their juridical, political, and moral conceptions. Each class creates, according to its economic structure, its own organs of struggle, thus asserting its particular conception of law. Hence, according to Lagardelle, each class within the class struggle aims to impose on society its own particular idea, and supplement that with the institutions which support that particular class and its idea or interest. Lagardelle goes on, quote, "The revolutionary fact of modern times does not consist so much in the formation by large industry of a growing proletariat as in the creation by that proletariat of a series of specific institutions opposed to the institutions of the capitalist regime. Within its unions and cooperatives, the working class expresses its modes of thought and elaborates new rules of life, morality, and law. These same ideals were promoted by Georges Sorel's other prominent disciple, Edward Berth. Within his 1910 book, The New Aspects of Socialism, Edward Berth wrote, "Direct action is the glorification of the autonomy of all working forces. Syndicalism calls upon the energy, initiative, and audacity of each worker. Revolutionary syndicalism to Berth rested on the fact that the proletariat could not use the liberal state to its advantage. The proletarian worker needed, in other words, to act through his own class." Despite their notoriety and popularity both in history and in their contemporary eras, Georges Sorel and his disciples constituted one specific tendency of revolutionary socialism. These figures weren't standard socialists, if you couldn't tell already, and upon examining each of their life paths individually, it's clear why. In September of 1908, Georges Sorel ceased his collaboration with Hubert Lagardelle's paper, The Socialist Movement, and the following year he joined French Action. At the same time, through his numerous contacts across the Alps and into Italy, Georges Sorel contributed substantially to a convergence between revolutionary syndicalism in Italy and the revolutionary nationalism of Enrico Corradini. In one article published at the end of 1940, Pierre-Drew La Rochelle noted that the movement initiated by Georges Sorel had perished in France with the First World War, and had found continuity only in Italy thanks to none other than Benito Mussolini. Sorel, in fact, commented on Mussolini while he was still a young socialist, stating in 1912, "He is an Italian of the 15th century, a condottiere, the only man capable of remedying the weakness of government." Sorel would add on that, "He invented something not in my books, the union of the national and the social." After moving from the most contrarian and controversial vein of socialism to the most audacious of the right wing, Georges Sorel in 1917 had declared himself a supporter of the Bolshevik Revolution. Privately, he expressed reservations about the actions of the fascists in Italy, and died before having time to appreciate or condemn their governmental experience, but nonetheless, before he passed away, Sorel praised the fascists in dialogue with the Italian idealist Benedetto Croce, arguing, "The adventures of fascism are, at this moment, the most original social phenomenon in Italy. It seems to me that they go far beyond the combinations of politicians." In the last years of Georges Sorel's life, he had publicly supported Italy's imperial ambitions in the Adriatic, and though I've never seen any historians point this out, the fact is that he never once attempted to prevent the immense glorification that he enjoyed among fascist circles from 1914 until the time of his death in 1922, remaining silent regarding their homage to him in each and every one of those years. Within the Doctrine of Fascism, Benito Mussolini would write, "In the great current of fascism you will find the threads that departed from Sorel, from Pedagogy, from Lagardelle, from the socialist movement." As early as 1908, Benito Mussolini had published in one of his journals the Italian translation of one of Georges Sorel's articles, and in 1909 wrote his own piece regarding reflections on violence. Mussolini had commented on Sorel, stating, "Thanks to his books, we have been led to better understand Marxism, which had reached us from Germany in an unrecognizable state." Francisco Rolao Preto, the leading voice of fascism within Portugal, would state, "Sorel is for me the great master. He is perhaps the one who did everything." Edward Berth too accompanied Sorel in a migration from revolutionary syndicalism towards the nationalism of French Action, and despite joining the Communist Party in 1920, in 1925 he would abandon communism and once more return to his Sorelian roots. Edward Berth was the only follower of Sorel who decidedly did not join any fascist movement other than, well, the first fascist organization ever, the Cercle Proudhon, though he would eventually adopt fascism's class collaborationism anyways, stating in his final book, which was titled From Capital to Reflections on Violence, "Proudhon, Marx, and Sorel, it is under the aegis of these three great theorists that I would like to see the dawn of what I call the third phase of socialism, the phase of living ethics. Progress for workers must be made through experience, understanding, and collaboration. The state, employers, and workers are to act and collaborate, not as antagonists, but as participants in the evolution of the workers' historical project, a project that, while acknowledging the historical Marxist contributions, must embrace the concrete and transformative work of creating a new society from the ground up, one that addresses the failures and excesses of both the past Marxist and capitalist systems." By contrast, Hubert Lagardelle remained at the heart of events in France until the very end. Entering politics as an Orthodox Marxist, Hubert Lagardelle's contact with Georges Sorel drove him into radicalism. In 1899, Lagardelle founded the Socialist Movement, or Le Mouvement Socialiste, or something like that, I don't speak French, I'm sorry, which was the main organ of revolutionary syndicalism in France, in which notable intellectuals and several leading figures of the European left wing wrote. In 1909, when Georges Sorel and some of his disciples began collaborating with French Action, not only Lagardelle, but the other editors of his journal repudiated that orientation organization and broke with Sorel the following year. Hubert Lagardelle eventually joined the fascist party of Georges Valois, known as Le Fichu, even campaigning for the party in a secondary role. Le Fichu was one of the first fascist parties to emerge outside of Italy. By 1931, Hubert Lagardelle had taken a prominent role in promoting fascism in France. Eventually, he would find himself in an unfortunate appointment under Nazi-occupied France, collaborating with the Vichy regime to sell French citizens into forced labor for Germany through the compulsory labor service, providing the Reich with 70,000 slaves for manual labor. It's only ironic that Lagardelle, who had spent his whole life defending the autonomy of labor, was now ending it by selling his fellow Frenchmen into slavery. And it's even more ironic that once arrested by the Allied powers, Lagardelle would be sentenced to forced labor for the rest of his life. Within the same clear pages where Lagardelle had developed his own systematic theory of proletarian autonomy, he had consistently argued in favor of the natural development of a political elite class, stating, "From the moment we have before us real men, workers who do not possess identical qualities and do not perform the same functions, a differentiation necessarily occurs among them. The most conscious, the most apt for self-defense and social struggle, are the first to group together, showing others the way they should follow. That is to say, that a selection operates, and from the point of view of the proletariat's evolution, the formations thus created acquire primary importance." According to Hubert Lagardelle, union leaders as members of a new political elite would take the form of a stable bureaucracy, presenting themselves as new professional leaders of the working class. He states in this very long excerpt, "What has already been called the tyranny of the syndicates is nothing other than the directing power normally transferred to selected groups, that is to say, to the organism made up of the workers most capable of safeguarding the interests of the entire class. The more the union groups act and deliberate in the name of all workers, the more their role as directing and representative organs of the proletarian mass asserts itself." But unorganized workers cannot claim, by virtue of any superior individual right to the right of all, to destroy the principle of workers' government by professional groups. The labor movement tends to be stable and organic. The world of labor constitutes a world apart. Production work is difficult. It requires a certain sum of qualifications and makes the existence of a strong hierarchy necessary. This hierarchy forms naturally according to the law of selection in the organization of the working class. Indeed, nothing afflicts elites more than being absorbed by the masses, that is, losing precisely their elite character. What a dreadful fate. Hubert Lagardelle's same theory regarding the elites would be picked up by Edward Berth to conflate proletarian autonomy with workers' alienation in the service of capital. Within his book, The Misdeeds of Intellectuals, Edward Berth focuses his critique of capitalism particularly on speculators, representatives of commercial and financial capital, accusing specifically those capitalists of being parasites. Regardless, he praised the entrepreneurial spirits of the early capitalist captains of industry, the industrialists. He refers to them as the great achievers of a bold, powerful, and innovative capitalism. For Berth, this autocratic and hierarchical division of labor, instituted by capital in the workshop, should give place to an egalitarian association of free and non-hierarchized workers, a workshop without masters. Despite this change within the workshop, Berth still considered syndicalism within his book, Misdeeds of Intellectuals, as the legitimate child of capitalism, and because of this, within his vision, syndicalism would leave the productive forces and the technology that presided over them unchanged. As Berth would state, the gratitude that syndicalism owes to capitalism is not limited to the material riches it has created, but also, and above all, to the moral and spiritual transformations it has effected in the working masses, which, thanks to its iron discipline, have been torn from their primitive laziness to become capable of an ever more perfect collective labor. Now, from here onward, Edward Berth turns to define freedom. To Edward Berth, freedom was best defined as the cultivated capacity for voluntary, collective self-discipline that arises only after and because of the historical constraints of authority imposed by the bosses of the workshop as well as the state. To quote Edward Berth, syndicalism fully recognized that civilization began, and had to begin with, constraint. That this constraint was salutary, beneficial, and creative, and that if it is possible to hope for a regime of freedom without the tutelage of bosses and the state, it is still thanks to that same regime of constraint that disciplined humanity and progressively made it capable of rising to free and voluntary labor. The synthesis of all of these ideas and themes can be found in the writings of the Italian syndicalist Sergio Panunzio, who had come to participate in the founding of the Italian Fasces of Combat, or Fasci di Combattimento, in 1919, and eventually become the leading theoretician of the fascist fascist government in the 1920s. In the words of Panunzio, when the exploitation inherent to the capitalist enterprise's organism is eliminated by the unification and free association of the productive factors, which will already be in the hands of unionized workers, there will still remain groups of producers who will need a technical regime, a direction. Even in the workers' economic regime established by the syndicates, without a capitalist class or state, there will exist an authoritarian principle, let us call it that, which inevitably results from the technical imperatives of labor and production. Edward Berth couldn't have agreed more. From the theory of a necessarily authoritative vanguard from which the syndicalist revolution would grow, emerged the principle of authority and the ideal of the total state. As Yves Sternhell would write, a society founded on the criteria exposed by Sorel, Berth, Pouquet, Lagardelle, or Griffuelhes would have presented the main characteristics of the ideal type of a fascist society, directed by the conscious, the revolted who feel boundless contempt for democracy and for the bourgeoisie way of life. This syndicalist society claimed to shape a new type of man, born by the audacity, the marvelous discipline emanating from the army of striking workers. The revolutionary momentum came to depend on faith and will rather than on the consciousness of historical evolution. This explains why the meeting with Action Française was not fortuitous and resulted from a very similar conception of the political good and of historical forces. Georges Sorel's book Illusions of Progress would review the concept of technical progress as an amoral social force. As Sorel argued, capitalist progress is real because it raises productivity, concentrates wealth, and at the same time creates the practical conditions, the skills, tools, organization, etc. that make social change possible. In his 1920 appendix, Sorel would even imagine how this authority of technological expertise becomes a political model. Quote, "The socialist workshop will group producers whose minds will always be alert to criticize learned practices, who will be guided by foremen analogous to the preparers of chemistry professors, and at the head of whom will be engineers who will speak to their men as a master speaks to his pupils." The conversion of the university Mandarin into the factory Mandarin legitimates the leadership of those who are technically qualified. Organizers, engineers, and specialists of all kind then, in Sorel's vision, replace traditional political actors. Most tellingly, Sorel would comment regarding the impressionability of the bourgeoisie that experience shows that the bourgeoisie can be easily stripped, provided it is somewhat subject to pressure and made fearful by revolution. The future belongs to that party that will know how to manipulate, with the greatest audacity, the revolutionary spectre. And again, it is all a matter of evaluation, of prudence, of opportunity. It takes much subtlety, tact, and calm audacity to conduct such diplomacy. Make the workers believe that one hoists the flag of revolution, make the bourgeoisie believe that the danger threatening it is over, and make the country believe that one represents an irresistible current of opinion. The decisive move is this. Sorel treated technical authority, the mythic mobilization of the masses, and the calculated use of discipline as rhetorical and strategic capital. These are the themes and features which fascism would simply bring to fruition. By translating to reality Sorel's prescriptions regarding myth, political persuasion, and the legitimacy of technical experts, fascism transferred into practice what until the March on Rome was simply the personal belief of a single intellectual. It was only within the idea of the marketplace, within the concept of economic competition, that Sorel conceived of the idea of class struggle and class warfare. For this reason, Sorel's economic worldview never ceased really to be liberal. Liberal economics are in large part based upon the principle that competition motivates change in the market, generally in a positive manner. It influences productivity and innovation. It's within this context that Sorel conceived of revolutionary struggle. In fact, Sorel consistently defended private property and economic competition, as noted, of course, by Yves Sternhell. He flat-out rejected any kind of nationalizations or state intervention out of the fear that such interventions would water down the effects of competition and the conflicts which emerged from such competition, which Sorel saw as necessary to moving society forward. Similarly, his disciple Edward Berth posited that the theses of Manchesterian liberalism were at the core of the theories of Marxism. He compared competition among industries to a battlefield, and denounced collective bargaining as a symptom of decadence on the part of the bourgeoisie and capitulation on the part of the proletariat. Arturo Labriola, one of the leading syndicalist followers of Georges Sorel within Italy, attacked Marxism for those same postulates. For Labriola, true socialism could only emerge from the unimpeded development of the capitalist economy. Sorel saw the reformist orientation of proletarian socialism and the concessions of the employing class as something which endangered civilization to self-annihilation. This tendency towards mediocrity, which was inherent in history, is something that Georges Sorel comments on within the Illusions of Progress. Such mediocrity and lukewarm reformism could only be fought by a vigorous resistance to the status quo. Having already equated technical genius with the notion of greatness and heroism, while equating decadence with mediocrity, Georges Sorel turned not to economics, but to art as the grounds from which these phenomena of greatness or mediocrity emerge. For Sorel, it was in art, religion, and philosophy where decadence and greatness were formed and torn down. Now, since bourgeoisie culture was a culture of the collective, of the masses, Sorel hoped to see a culture revived through the exaltation of the supreme individual and the veneration of great men of history. The exaltation of the individual attracted many anarchists to the syndicalist movement, at least according to Sorel. Contrary to the amoral and deterministic doctrines of Orthodox Marxism, Georges Sorel wrote, quote, "In May of 1899 I published in the Rivista Italiana di Sociologia an article on Marxism and social science. I ended it by expressing the wish that socialism be converted into a philosophy of morals. This transformation would have given greatness to a movement that was almost as devoid of it as democracy itself." This praise of class violence and the critique of conciliatory reformism could also be found within the works of sociologist Wilfred Pareto, with whom Sorel maintained a regular correspondence, as well as the general socialist movement within France more broadly, such as in the writings of French socialist Benoît Malon. Though Sorel personally didn't think much of the man, of Malon, it is contextually important that Malon attested that history was not simply determined by economic factors, but also by moral forces that must support the working class. This outlook led Malone to believe that socialism was not simply to be placed within the context of a class struggle, but within a civilizational context as well, a theme which Georges Sorel eventually picks up on at some point in his career. Although he was an attentive reader of Karl Marx, Sorel focused less on things like the mechanisms of relative surplus value or the model of base and superstructure, and more on the role of direct action in revolutionary change, unlike his orthodox Marxist contemporaries who were obsessed with analyzing the meaningless sections of Das Kapital as if Karl Marx was God and his works were the Bible. For Sorel, there wasn't any need to study the really complicated internal organization of the working class and its internal sociological structure, blah blah blah. For Sorel, the dynamism of direct action and the general strike were far more practically important for socialists to analyze. For Sorel, direct confrontations and the energy that they released were the objects central to the historical role of the proletariat. Worker syndicates and strikes were therefore the primary focal points of revolutionary agency. In Sorel's account, the general strike crystallized this ideal of moral energy and heroic action. Instead of being the outcome of a centralized political program, the general strike was supposed to be the eruption of collective vitality, or in Sorel's words, the most striking manifestation of the individualist force in the raised masses. Groups of workers who embraced the strike, Sorel wrote, quote, "Imagine the revolution as a huge uprising that can still be called individualist, each one marching with the greatest possible ardor, acting on his own account, hardly worrying about subordinating his conduct to a large, cleverly combined overall plan. This passionate call for proletarian autonomy alarmed the political class, even amongst the socialists, because it would leave no room for the familiar routines of party leadership. It stood as the antithesis of the cautious, conciliatory reformism that both Sorel and his friends like Pareto despised." Despite writing extensively against Christianity in his earlier years, in his later writings, Sorel likened the task of disciplining the proletariat to the Catholic Church's curation of small, rigorously trained militant orders, stating, quote, "Catholicism has always reserved combat functions for small bodies whose members were strictly selected by trials designed to verify their vocation. It is with elite troops perfectly trained thanks to monastic life that Catholicism has been able, until now, to triumph over its enemies. Likewise, as Georges Sorel suggested, the proletariat would need workers' syndicates and strike movements that could both gather the widest membership and at the same time foster the grouping of the strong elements. The revolutionary strike itself would help identify the most resolute militants, while other organizations mingled with the ordinary economic legal life of society would ensure that the unity required in a society occurs automatically. A small number of carefully chosen groups then would train proletarian thought by creating the ideological unity that the proletariat needs to accomplish its revolutionary work. Sorel thus moved from an early stress on the autonomous, almost artistic pedagogy of proletarian struggle toward a recognition of the role of dedicated organizers and select cadres within the syndicalist movement. Throughout, Sorel continued to acknowledge the proletariat, never really as an economic category, but instead as a reservoir of moral and spiritual force within civilization. This was the socialism of Georges Sorel. To quote him, one can say that, in general, the revolutionary spirit gains ground whenever the sense of economic necessity weakens. It is not in economics that one should look for the direct application of the notions of greatness and decadence. Thus, Sorel's reflections on myth, organization, and direct action extended his broader conviction that true historical greatness in every manner arises from the creative energies of great individuals and the small, disciplined groups that they compose, which are in turn capable of inspiring the masses. We already know the path of one of the Proudhon Circle's leaders. His name was Edward Berth. However, among the figures of French action, the one who would retain the most proletarian character was Georges Valois, who, up until this point, we haven't really touched on. Georges Valois, born Alfred Georges Gresset, was a former anarchist who had come into contact with Sorel during the last years of the 1800s. Valois joined French action in 1906, and by the 1910s Valois had fully developed his own syndicalist doctrine, praising Friedrich Nietzsche, Georges Sorel, the social myth, the medieval communes' corporative bodies, as well as French nationalist impulses. By 1925, however, Valois would abandon French action, and in October of that year, he founded the first fascist political party in France, the Faisceau, or Fasces in English. The Faisceau took in both conservatives who had abandoned French action as well as dissidents who had abandoned the Communist Party of France. This convergence disappeared by 1928, at which point Valois had started to distance himself from the implementation of fascism in Italy. As he stated himself, either we are gravely mistaken, or under the pressure of foreign financial forces, Italian fascism will evolve in a reactionary direction. Having gone through all stages of political alignment from the extreme left through to the extreme right from 1930 onwards, Georges Valois became a fierce critic of the fascist state in Italy. Despite this, his Republican Syndicalist party failed and the communists refused to welcome him back to the left, while by 1932 his faith in planned economics, which he had briefly taken up, began to wane. He denounced the CGT's 1934 action plan, and in 1935 was rejected by the French Socialist Party's leadership. He published his book Techniques of the Syndical Revolution in 1935, which was actually a very fascinating book to read, as it was a very well-informed critique of fascism from a man who had studied the fascist economy in Italy extensively. I don't agree with Valois at all in his conclusions regarding fascist Italy, but he does have some other good comments regarding the contemporary Stalinist regime in Russia, and he describes from a leftist perspective just how horrifically the USSR had, at that point, failed in delivering on its promises. Georges Valois would eventually be arrested by the French Vichy government and shipped off to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where he would die of typhus in 1945. The fateful trajectory of Georges Valois, Edward Berth, and Hubert Lagardelle was absolutely tragic in every conceivable way. Edward Berth, until his death in 1939, would continue to propose the same Sorelian syndicalism that he had at the turn of the century, a syndicalism that only practically existed in the memory of its former adherents who had all except him, unanimously turned towards fascism. Georges Valois and Edward Berth would forever part ways following a staunch disagreement regarding whether Mussolini or Lenin were the true revolutionaries of Europe. Ironically, they would both come to regret their earlier bets, losing hope in both the Soviet state as well as the fascist government in Italy by the end of the 1920s. Berth abandoned communism in 1925, while Lagardelle and Valois, both inaugurators of fascism in France, would abandon fascist Italy by 1928. Lagardelle would join the Vichy puppet government during World War II as Minister of Labour, and it was inside the very prisons of the very government that he was then a leader of that his old friend, Valois, a member now of the resistance, would be imprisoned before dying in a Nazi concentration camp. Enough talk of French people, there are far more important things to discuss. We are still yet to cover how all of these niche French figures led to very important impacts in world history, more specifically in Italy. Let's roll the clock back to 1914, on the dawn of the Great War. For the syndicalists, the war dreamed of by the revolutionary nationalists such as Enrico Corradini had finally arrived in the form of the First World War. At the forefront of the interventionist movement in favor of the First World War was to be found the syndicalists, who would provide the left with the principal bridge over towards revolutionary nationalism, a path followed by Benito Mussolini, as well as many others who followed him. In retrospect, and in light of the contemporary boogeyman narrative which has surrounded fascism, somebody like Benito Mussolini would seem to be the most unlikely candidate, period, to lead a fascist movement ever. His father was an active militant in the First Internationale, in an era where Italian socialism was mostly inspired by anarchist thinkers such as Bakunin. His father would later become a staunch reformist, though this didn't stop a young Benito Mussolini from sympathizing with vanguardist thought. From 1906 onward, Benito Mussolini followed the trajectory of Georges Sorel's intellectual career with great interest, and was among the greatest critics of Sorel when he started his alliance with the reactionary conservatives of French action. While Benito Mussolini was a member of the Italian Socialist Party, he personally led the Maximalist faction, advocating for the most extreme and radical form of socialism as could possibly be conceived. Based upon the name Maximalism alone, it is clear that Benito Mussolini wanted to bring the most raw, extreme, and maximal form of socialism into practice. In 1910, Benito Mussolini proposed that the revolutionary socialists of the Italian Socialist Party split away from the party. Despite his failure to organize a popular split from the Italian Socialist Party, Mussolini continued his activism as a dissident socialist. In 1911, on the occasion of the Libyan campaign, Mussolini became distinguished in his call for a general strike against the war in Libya, in opposition to the revolutionary syndicalists of Italy, who were generally, and most often, quite militaristic. Despite this, in 1912, when he was elected to the national leadership of the Italian Socialist Party and put in charge of the most important social daily paper, Mussolini expelled the reformist socialists and invited some Italian syndicalists of both the pro- and anti-war sentiments, such as Enrico Leone and Arturo Labriola, to collaborate with him. The admixture of libertarian and Marxist thought which had always guided Benito Mussolini's ideology was now in the upper echelons of the Socialist Party's leadership. Mussolini, as the party's new editor, increased the circulation of the party's paper fivefold in little over a year. His message had been a riveting success among the people of Italy. Although at this point Benito Mussolini believed that the workers' syndicates needed to be subjected to a socialist vanguard party, he still held firm in his support for the strikes launched in the first half of 1913 by the Italian Syndical Union against the advice of the syndicalists of the General Confederation of Labour, or the CGL, as well as the reformist socialists. At the end of 1913, Mussolini had founded a review he called Utopia, named after Thomas More's work. Within that publication, Mussolini expressed his own individual thoughts, which did not necessarily correspond to the attitudes required of a party leader. Some of the greatest Marxist voices of the era, such as Amedeo Bordiga and Angelo Tasca, contributed to Mussolini's review. In April of 1914, at the Italian Socialist Party's 14th National Congress, the left wing of the maximalist socialists triumphed, and Benito Mussolini became one of the three principal leaders of the Italian Socialist Party. 2 months later, on the eve of the First World War, the Italian proletariat launched the Red Week, which Benito Mussolini threw himself into without hesitation. Given this history, out of all of the political leaders influenced by revolutionary syndicalism, none of them were more reluctant than Mussolini to abandon the class struggle for the national struggle. Without ever abandoning the theses proposed by Sorel and his followers, Mussolini, for over a decade, managed to avoid the practical consequences that were necessarily implicit within the doctrines that he upheld. Yet, in the last 3 months of 1914, Benito Mussolini joined his peers of the radical left at the forefront of the pro-war interventionist campaign. Perhaps the young Mussolini did not at first perceive any contradiction between socialism and nationalism, no more than earlier romantic revolutionaries such as Mazzini or Garibaldi had, whose examples he admired. Yet his youthful sympathies took shape in concrete places and experiences that would later permit a different ordering of loyalties. In January of 1909, Benito Mussolini accepted a post as Secretary of the Chamber of Labour in Trento, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as the directorship of a small weekly of the Italian branch of the Austrian Social Democratic movement. Mussolini was expelled by the authorities from Trento in September of 1909 and later published his impressions in El Trentino veduto da un socialista. I'm sorry if I mispronounced anything, which was published in 1911. Mussolini noted that most of the province's population felt little appetite to die for annexation to Italy, an outlook that punctured the hopes of the irredentists who had imagined a popular drive for immediate unification. At the same time, he argued that the Social Democrats' centralizing parliamentary strategy risked ignoring the region's linguistic and economic particularities. The defense of political autonomy, grassroots union activity, and decentralized forms of struggle, Mussolini suggested, could give separatist energies a social basis, a diagnosis that unintentionally and early on sketched the terrain where both revolutionary nationalist and syndicalist impulses would meet. The events of Il Trentino already contain, by implication, the elements that would later be articulated in Benito Mussolini's rhetoric as a fascist: the primacy of moral and cultural force over straightforward economic determinism, the valorization of local vigor over bureaucratic centralism, and the idea that militant forms of life can generate new political identities. Some might argue that Benito Mussolini returned from Trento already unknowingly very anti-Austrian and nationalist, and that the experience had awakened in him the values of homeland, nation, national ideals, and class solidarity, though this post hoc reading risks imposing the logic of Mussolini's later pro-war and fascist career on a moment that was, in fact, more equivocal. What decisively ruptured any neat continuity was the First World War. The war's mass violence and existential stakes swept aside the doctrinal certainties of the revolutionary syndicalism of the era and forced militants to reposition their hopes onto new horizons. Where Lenin and Zimmerwald internationalists sought to convert the so-called imperialist slaughter into a communist revolution, other activists such as Enrico Corradini urged that the class struggle of Marxism ought to be instead reframed within a national framework. The trenches of the World War became, for these figures, the school in which militants would be remade as citizens and soldiers of a new people. Mussolini's own conversion to this belief in proletarian nations was sudden. Having long defended and been disappointed by his socialist comrades at home, Benito Mussolini, in autumn of 1914, moved towards a pro-war position that reordered heroic political energy around national ends. To Mussolini, the returning combatants were the seedbed of a new political synthesis. The wounded and sick soldiers of today would be the vanguard of the great army that would return tomorrow. By the time that fascism was launched and pitched publicly to the Italian people, the logic was explicit. Fascism wasn't opposed to socialism for being socialist, but for being opposed to the nation, as Benito Mussolini himself announced in the founding phase of fascism. In his own words, quote, "We declare war against socialism, not because it is socialism, but because it has opposed nationalism. We intend to be an active minority, attract the proletariat away from the official Socialist Party. But if the middle class thinks that we are going to be their lightning rods, they are mistaken." The veneration of energetic leadership, the pedagogical force of struggle, the selective formation of militant cadres, and the mythic appeal to greatness, all central features of the syndicalism crafted by Georges Sorel, were now applied to a new telos. Where Sorel had placed greatness in the moral and aesthetic renewal of the proletariat, Benito Mussolini and his followers reinvigorated the same idioms toward a project that fused militant syndicalism with a national renewal in mind. Fascism came to call for the liberation not just of the proletariat, but of the poor and impoverished nations against predatory plutocracies. In 1935-36, when Italy invaded Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, Fascist Italy expressed that this campaign was a war of civilization and liberation. The campaign was, in the eyes of Mussolini, a proletarian war. Across the phases of syndicalist development, one can trace a continuity in method, if not in final aims. All of the features that Georges Sorel had first emphasized were simply redeployed within a national vocabulary, a synthesis that gave birth to something new, an ideological current in which both syndicalist and nationalist objectives intersected, a current which would take on the name of fascism.